Tonight, the image coming out of the Middle East is not one of a single border clash or an isolated missile alert. It is the image of a region being pulled once again toward a wider war by actors operating across several fronts at the same time. At the center of that picture are reports that the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon have resumed coordinated attacks against Israel, with claims that more than 50 military and strategic points were struck in a synchronized wave. That number matters, not only because of its scale, but because of what it is meant to communicate. When an armed network claims to have hit over 50 vital points in one coordinated operation, the message is larger than the physical damage itself. It is a statement about reach, about planning, and about the ability to impose pressure on an opponent from multiple directions at once. Now, let me be clear at the start. Many of the battlefield claims circulating in the first hours of such an escalation are difficult to verify independently, and that applies here as well. But even before every impact site is confirmed, the broader strategic significance is already visible. This was presented as a combined retaliatory action, and that alone changes the regional calculus. According to the accounts now circulating, waves of ballistic missiles, drones, and other precision-guided munitions were launched toward Israeli military infrastructure, air defense positions, command facilities, logistics nodes, and what were described as strategic sites. The Houthis were reported to have directed fire towards southern and central Israel, while Hezbollah launched from the north. In operational terms, that creates the kind of pressure every defense planner fears most. Simultaneous threats arriving from separate theaters, compressing response time, and stretching interception capacity. This is not just about the volume of fire, it is about geometry. Israel's defense network is layered, sophisticated, and battle-tested, but no defensive system functions in a vacuum. When threats are launched from Lebanon in the north and from Yemen to the south, the problem becomes one of timing, allocation, radar management, interceptor availability, and decision-making under severe compression. Stay with that point, because it is the core mechanism behind this entire episode. A multi-front barrage does not need to fully break a defense architecture to be strategically effective. It only needs to force hard trade-offs, create uncertainty, and expose the difference between nominal protection and real-world saturation under pressure. Reports describe impacts or attempted strikes against air defense batteries, command centers, logistics hubs, and infrastructure tied to military operations. If even a portion of those claims is accurate, then the operation was not random harassment. It was designed, at least in concept, to probe where the system is strongest, where it is thin, and where an adversary might generate cascading disruption at relatively low cost. So that is the first major point. The significance here is not simply whether every claimed target was destroyed. The significance is that the attack was framed as a synchronized offensive intended to test deterrence and challenge the idea that Israel can contain threats on separate fronts without facing a combined regional response. The second point is political. The reappearance of coordinated action between the Houthis and Hezbollah signals a renewed degree of alignment inside the broader network, often referred to as the axis of resistance. That phrase is not merely ideological branding. It describes a loose but strategically meaningful constellation of armed actors whose value to Iran lies precisely in their ability to create distributed pressure without requiring a conventional state-on-state confrontation at the opening stage. In that sense, this moment is not only about Israel. It is about Iran's regional deterrent model. Tehran has long relied on a networked structure in which affiliated groups operate from different geographies under different local conditions with different arsenals, but can still contribute to a common pressure campaign when a larger signal needs to be sent. And the signal, according to the timing and framing of this operation, appears to be retaliation and resilience. After setbacks, assassinations, interdictions, and repeated military pressure on Iranian-aligned actors, These groups are attempting to demonstrate that they remain capable of coordinated action. And, they are saying, in effect, that pressure has not dissolved the network and that the network can still impose costs. That does not mean the message is entirely credible in every detail. Armed movements often exaggerate outcomes, overstate damage, and use inflated target lists to shape perceptions. But perception is part of warfare, and in the current media environment, the psychological dimension can be nearly as important as the physical effects in the first critical hours. This is where the claim of more than 50 vital points becomes especially important. Even if the confirmed number ultimately proves lower, the claim itself is doing strategic work. It is trying to project an image of scale, competence, and momentum, and it is trying to plant a question in the minds of regional governments, global markets, and the Israeli public. If this many sites can be threatened in one wave, what happens if the next wave is larger? That question is not abstract. It reaches directly into civilian life. Sirens, shelter alerts, flight disruptions, school closures, infrastructure strain, and fear in border communities are not side stories to a military exchange. And they are central to the purpose of this kind of campaign, because the objective is not only to damage military assets, but to create a sense that the security environment is becoming less predictable and less containable. Israeli authorities, according to the reporting, move forces to high alert and urge civilians near vulnerable areas to seek shelter. That response is entirely consistent with the operational reality of a multi-directional strike environment. Even where interceptions are successful, debris from incoming projectiles and interceptor activity can still create lethal risk on the ground, and the burden on emergency services rises very quickly when alerts spread across multiple zones. If you step back for a moment, what you see is a layered contest between offense and defense, and between message and counter-message. The attackers are trying to show that Israel can be reached, stressed, and compelled to react. Israel, in turn, must show that the strikes can be contained, absorbed, and answered in a way that restores deterrence rather than eroding it further. That restoration of deterrence is now the central strategic question. Once an attack of this scale is claimed, a government facing it cannot think only in terms of immediate interception and repair. It must also think in terms of what future adversaries will conclude if the response is judged too narrow, too delayed, or too cautious. This is why experts are already warning about possible Israeli counterstrikes against supply lines, launch infrastructure, storage sites, or command nodes in southern Lebanon and Yemen. Such responses would fit a long-established deterrence logic. If a proxy launches sustained attacks, then the systems enabling those attacks become targets. But that logic also carries a major escalatory risk, because striking those enabling networks can trigger wider rounds of retaliation rather than ending the cycle. And that brings us to the third major point. This flare-up lands at a moment when the region was already tense. The Middle East does not absorb a coordinated multi-front strike in isolation. Every actor watching this event is reading it through a broader lens that includes maritime security, U.S. force posture, Iranian strategic signaling, Gulf state risk assessments, and the durability of fragile diplomatic channels. The energy dimension is especially important. Markets do not wait for complete battlefield verification when a serious regional escalation appears to be underway. If traders believe that conflict could expand, threaten shipping routes, or increase the probability of disruption near critical maritime corridors, prices move on anticipation long before any actual closure takes place. This is why a missile and drone exchange in Israel, Lebanon, and Yemen can very quickly become an energy story in Europe, Asia, and North America. Insurance costs for shipping can rise, freight calculations change, risk premiums widen, and suddenly what appears to be a military confrontation in one part of the world begins to feed directly into fuel prices inflation expectations, and political pressure far beyond the region. That is not speculation in a dramatic sense. It is the normal way modern strategic shocks transmit through the global economy. In a tightly connected energy and trade environment, the fear of disruption can be economically meaningful even before disruption is physically realized. Now, there is another layer here that deserves attention. The Houthis and Hezbollah do not operate from identical circumstances, and their military capabilities are not interchangeable. Hezbollah has long been understood as one of the most heavily armed non-state actors in the region, with extensive experience, established infrastructure, and a long-standing confrontation line with Israel. The Houthis, by contrast, have developed long-range strike capabilities under very different conditions, using missiles and drones to project influence from Yemen into wider regional space. So when these two actors are described as acting in concert, the value is not merely additive, it is complementary. One threatens from immediate proximity in the north with a dense and familiar front. The other threatens from a much greater distance, complicating warning patterns and broadening the defensive map. That kind of operational complementarity is one reason the current reports have generated such concern. A northern front alone is dangerous. A southern long-range threat alone is manageable but costly. Put them together, especially if timed to overlap, and the result is a qualitatively different challenge. It is also a challenge built for attrition. Drones, lower-cost strike systems, and repeated salvos do not need to win a decisive military victory to be strategically useful. They can force an opponent to consume expensive interceptors, maintain elevated readiness for extended periods, and live inside a cycle where the economic and psychological cost of defense rises with every new wave. This is one of the enduring asymmetries of modern regional conflicts. The side launching relatively inexpensive systems often seeks to impose a far higher defensive bill on the side trying to stop them. And over time, that does not guarantee battlefield success, but it can shape tempo, endurance, and political debate. That is why the phrase, "more than 50 vital points," should also be read as part of a campaign of narrative warfare. It is meant to imply that Israeli defenses were not merely challenged, but penetrated at scale. Whether that exact portrayal holds up under scrutiny is a separate question. The immediate objective is to create the perception of vulnerability and momentum. Israel will be equally aware of that information battle. In the hours after such an attack, governments do not only manage interceptors and aircraft, they manage public confidence. They decide what to reveal, what to confirm, what to withhold, and how to signal resilience without understating risk. And this is where neutral analysis requires discipline. There will be intense pressure from all sides to collapse the story into slogans, either a narrative of overwhelming enemy success or a narrative of total defensive control. Real conflict is rarely so clean. The truth is usually found in the friction between claims, interceptions, partial impacts, damaged infrastructure, military censorship, and the slow process of verification. Even so, some conclusions can already be drawn. First, the current escalation shows that Iran-aligned armed groups remain capable of generating coordinated pressure across more than one theater. Second, the perceived need to demonstrate that capability suggests a continuing struggle over deterrence after recent blows to their network. Third, the political and economic effects of these actions extend well beyond the immediate launch zones. There is also an intelligence question here that should not be ignored. Coordinated attacks of this sort require some degree of planning, timing, discipline, target selection, and communication. That does not automatically prove direct centralized control over every launch, but it does suggest that these theaters are not operating in complete isolation from one another. For regional militaries and their allies, that has practical implications. It means warning systems must not only track launches, they must assess whether apparently separate incidents are in fact components of a broader synchronized effort. It also means that future defensive planning will place even greater emphasis on inventory depth, early warning integration, and rapid coordination across fronts. Now consider the diplomatic side. Every round of escalation narrows space for de-escalation, at least temporarily. Governments that might otherwise have explored quiet back channels become more constrained by domestic anger, military urgency, and alliance expectations. Once civilians are sheltering and footage of explosions dominates the news cycle, the political appetite for restraint tends to contract. At the same time, that very intensity can produce a paradox. The closer a region moves to wider war, the more urgently outside powers may work behind the scenes to stop it. So what looks on the surface like an unstoppable slide can sometimes trigger intense private diplomacy precisely because the costs of open-ended escalation become too obvious to ignore. The problem, of course, is timing. Military systems move in minutes and hours. Diplomatic systems often move in days. If retaliation cycles accelerate faster than mediation channels can function, then the window for containment narrows very quickly. That is why the next phase matters more than the opening headlines. If the reported strikes are followed by limited, targeted responses designed to signal capability without opening entirely new fronts, there is still a path to managed escalation. But if major retaliatory strikes expand the target set, deepen civilian disruption, or hit nodes seen as politically or symbolically central, then the risk curve rises sharply. There are, broadly speaking, three scenarios worth watching. The first is the contained exchange scenario, in which Israel responds forcefully but selectively, and the attacking groups declare symbolic success while avoiding steps. That would force an all-out regional confrontation. That is the least destructive path, though even it would leave deterrence fragile. The second is the rolling escalation scenario. In that case, each side seeks to restore credibility through additional strikes, but without formally crossing the threshold into total war. This is often the most dangerous pattern because it creates the illusion of control while steadily increasing the probability of miscalculation. Then there is the third scenario, regional widening. In that case, strikes on Yemen, southern Lebanon, or other enabling infrastructure provoke sustained retaliation. Shipping risk intensifies. External powers become more visibly involved, and what began as a retaliatory wave turns into a prolonged multi-theater crisis. That is the scenario global markets are already trying to price, and it is the one regional governments most fear even when their public rhetoric remains hard. It is also important to understand why such coordination resonates beyond the immediate battlefield. For supporters of these groups, a combined strike is meant to show solidarity and endurance, and the ability to answer pressure with pressure. For their opponents, it reinforces the argument that Iran's regional network remains a chronic source of instability, capable of dragging multiple societies toward conflict. Those are not merely competing talking points, they are competing strategic narratives, and both have audiences. One is directed at regional publics angry over war and intervention. The other is directed at allies, donors, military planners, and international actors concerned with deterrence, shipping, and state stability. Public outrage, meanwhile, is likely to rise on all sides. In Israel, any perceived breach in security can generate powerful demands for retaliation and restoration of deterrence. In the wider region, retaliatory strikes by Israel can in turn fuel anger, recruitment, and justification for further confrontation. That cycle is one of the central engines of this conflict environment. And that is the deeper tragedy of the moment. Every actor claims to be restoring deterrence. Every round of violence is explained as necessary to prevent the next one. Yet the cumulative effect is often the opposite. More fronts activated, more red lines blurred, and more room for escalation through misreading rather than deliberate design. So when you hear that more than 50 vital points were targeted or destroyed, do not read it only as a battlefield statistic. Read it as a signal embedded inside a larger contest over deterrence, credibility, alliance, cohesion, and regional order. The number is part of the story, but the strategic architecture around the number is the bigger story. What we are watching is not random turbulence. It is a test of whether a networked regional pressure strategy can impose real costs on a heavily defended state, and whether that state can answer without triggering a broader war that pulls in more actors and destabilizes trade and energy flows. That is the real question now unfolding. In the coming hours, several things will matter more than dramatic headlines. Independent confirmation of the actual damage will matter. The scale and location of any Israeli response will matter. Signals from Tehran, Washington, Beirut, and regional capitals will matter. And just as importantly, the tempo of follow-on launches will tell us whether this was a singular, coordinated statement or the opening move in a larger sequence. For now, the most sober conclusion is this. The reports point to a serious escalation, a renewed display of cross-front coordination, and a deliberate effort to test Israeli defenses and regional resolve. Whether that effort becomes a brief shock or the first chapter of a wider storm depends on choices that will be made very soon under pressure with incomplete information and in one of the most combustible strategic environments on Earth. Smoke may clear from individual impact sites, but the implications will not clear so easily. A synchronized strike from Yemen and Lebanon is not only a military event, it is a strategic warning about how interconnected this conflict has become, how quickly multiple theaters can fuse into one crisis, and how narrow the margin for error now appears to be. That is the reality tonight. Not certainty, not final casualty maps, not perfect verification, but a dangerous convergence of claims, capabilities, and intent. And somewhere behind the immediate noise of sirens and statements, the unanswered question remains the one that matters most. Was this a dramatic but limited act of retaliation, or the signal flare before a much larger regional confrontation?